Hey everyone, Jen here. I'm the founder and executive director of the Muddy Pug Farm and Sanctuary outside of Maple Valley, Washington. And it is a beautiful morning on the sanctuary. And we are continuing on with our series, One Day I Want to Have a Farm Sanctuary. And we're continuing through the first chapter, which is the fantasy versus reality of running a sanctuary. And this section is called Rescue is a Lonely World. And I often, as we've talked about before, when I tell people that I run a farm sanctuary, people think that it is the most idyllic life and that you are living in this beautiful place. You're surrounded by animals and it's a wonderful, loving experience. And sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's not. And the reason that rescue and the work of the sanctuary can be very isolating and lonely are really three main reasons. The first is your peer group of people who can deeply understand the work you do, that are colleagues, that might be mentors, is incredibly small relative to the general population. And those people are just as busy as you are, and we find ourselves running incredibly hard and have to be very intentional about the time that we carve out to connect with one another, to support one another. But it is a very lonely experience in the day-to-day of sanctuary work because you don't necessarily have colleagues and co-workers unless you are someone who is extraordinarily blessed to have a partner that has committed to also doing this work with you. And the subset part of that is that in addition to having a limited number of colleagues, you also are often doing a lot of research and trying to figure out how to run a sanctuary on your own. And the reason is most people that come to a farm sanctuary are not necessarily people that grew up in agriculture. And that's because if you grew up in agriculture and farming, especially livestock farming, your philosophical framework is very different, and how you view animals and what they're here for and what their purpose is very different than someone who runs a sanctuary. I'm not saying it's impossible for someone to make that transition. Those transitions happen, but it is more rare, and we often come to this line of work where we are like the only person in our current circle of friends and family who does this work, which can be very isolating because there's just a lack of understanding. And there's not a lot of people to talk to and collaborate with, like in the moment, in the day-to-day, the way that you would have access to people to like commiserate with and stuff on like a real-time basis like you would at a day job. A day job. I have a day job. That's what I do in my day job. The other part of sort of doing that research and so forth on your own is that you really feel like it's you against the world in trying to make everything that goes on the sanctuary happen, and you feel like it's only up to you. We are super fortunate. I have a wonderful person, Amber, who helps and works on the sanctuary. We have some volunteers who help on specific days with the sanctuary, but really the person who bears the mental load of running the sanctuary and thinking about things and making things happen is me. And that can be a very lonely experience, and it can be a very exhausting experience. And so if you're thinking about going into this sort of work, I know I've said it before, please volunteer at a sanctuary, and not just volunteer on the fun front end work of like feeding and watering the animals, but help with infrastructure projects, help with the back office things associated with running a sanctuary, so that you can get a real level set of what it means to bear the day-to-day mental load of what it takes to run a sanctuary, and that will help you to understand like what the energy level is, the things that you have to worry about, what are things that you will have to take on, what are things that you could solve for by working with other people. It's important to have a sense of what that work looks like, and to think about how do you manage that sense of loneliness and isolation and feeling like you're the only person who does this. So it's interesting because I am an off the charts introvert. I remember taking the Myers-Briggs when I was a teenager, and I was like at the far scale of introversion, and that freaking thing has not budged one iota through my adult life. I'm now 49, still a hardcore introvert. So in some ways for me, being on my own doing the work of the sanctuary is very soothing, and it can be very restorative and energizing. If you are someone who is an extrovert and you derive a lot of energy from being around people, like this is something you should really think about. And as we get through the series of this book, and we're bringing up these different points, the point is not to tell you that you can't do this, but the point is for you to be aware of what it takes so that you can more proactively solve for this for yourself, and it will save you a significant amount of stress. Like, you can't prepare for everything, but having a good understanding of what's entailed with something will help you to roll with that a little bit easier. I do want to give a huge shout out to Z and the team at the Open Sanctuary Project. So the Open Sanctuary Project is a fellow nonprofit that is dedicated to providing sanctuaries with all of the resources that they might need to open and run a sanctuary. And they have been in existence for over 7 years now. I know as I was standing up the sanctuary, they provide a tremendous amount of resources on things like, finances, setting up a board, individual animal care and considerations. And so there are resources that are coming up and coming to fruition. And the Open Sanctuary Project doesn't just support sanctuaries in the U.S. They are working really hard to provide all of their resources in additional languages so they can provide sanctuaries around the world. But that is a great place, if you are thinking of opening a sanctuary, for you to go and, find resources that are available to you. But that brings me to sort of the second area of why rescue is a very lonely world. And the Open Sanctuary Project exists because they are providing what we call in the sanctuary community compassionate resources towards animal care. And this is something that I had no idea was such a challenge to take on as I was starting the sanctuary. I remember it was about 2 years ago that I decided to change out the type of bedding that we were using for the cows. And so I'm like, okay, the bedding that we have is not really working. I'm going to start doing research. And 95% of the research that's out there related to animal husbandry is for factory farms, I'll be honest. And it is not necessarily geared towards people who want to see animals living an enriching and long and healthy life. The resources that are out there are really geared towards how do you increase your yield of an animal and get them to a state of maximum production in the shortest and most profitable period of time. And that is not what a sanctuary is about. And so it's often very difficult knowing that you're running a sanctuary and you look out in the world and there are very few people percentage-wise who look at animals and feel the way that you do about animals. And because we are a sanctuary, because we keep animals for the duration of their lives, it is really challenging to ask for support. It's really challenging to get people to understand sort of what your philosophical orientation is. And that's because as we have grown up in nearly every country over time, most of the cultures in the world embrace a philosophy that animals are here to be subjugated and used in any way that we see fit. And that is such a profound demarcation of how we orient ourselves. And it shows up in really subtle ways. Like, there's two examples that I want to give. The first example is, you are seeing this through social media. We engage in social media to kind of get the word out about the sanctuary and the work that we do. And what's really interesting is I notice that posts on social media, and this is across all platforms, when I post about traditionally companion animals, especially our dogs and our cats, those posts get significantly more likes and engagements. And it's interesting that there are just, people are just wired to think of companion animals as the only animals who are really deserving of love, of peace, of happiness, of safety, of care. And it's interesting to see that other farmed animals who are just as intelligent, who are just as capable of feeling pain, who feel loss when they are separated from the other animals that they are bonded to, they do not get the same level of consideration as companion animals, which is a really interesting form of cognitive dissonance that we employ, and that informs how we think about farmed animals and whether they should be cared for and protected the way that the sanctuary cares for and protects them. The other interesting example is there were two colleagues who were having a conversation about the work on the sanctuary, and it was at a time when we had Dakota was very ill, and he ended up succumbing to leptospirosis. And a colleague was sharing a conversation that he had with another colleague of mine who was talking about how sad it was that Dakota had passed away, how, impactful that must be. And my colleague said, you have to understand that this happens all the time on the sanctuary, and it's just like a normal event. And it was both like a very insightful thing to say, but there was also a part of me that felt like, oh, well, fuck yeah, I do deal with grief on a daily basis. And for example, this morning I woke up and walked into the bun area, and Dewdrop had passed away overnight. And it was like 5:30 in the morning when I found her, and I just sat down in the bun area, and all of the other bunnies that she lived with were sitting around her in a circle, and just kind of, they would come up and they would bump her with their noses, and it was just so profoundly sad. It was sad that she passed away, and I wasn't there. I don't know if she was sick. We're gonna get a necropsy done on her to see kind of what happened. But it was sad to think that I was not there and I potentially could have done something. It was sad to see the reaction of the other buns that she had lived with, some of which were her own kids, and to see that they were upset and grieving and didn't kind of get what was going on. And I had a good cry. We all sat there together for a good length of time. And then I had to get up and I had to finish taking care of everyone else. And I'm also going to have to just carry on and continue to do the rest of the work of taking care of everyone. And then I'm going to have to log in and do my day job for the rest of the day. And that sort of managing through the grief of running a sanctuary that sort of grief and how we manage through that is something that is very normalized in the work of rescue. And you deal with an extraordinary level of stress. We've talked about it before: financial stress, emotional stress, physical stress, even it's kind of like spiritual stress. And you often deal with that on your own in the moment. And because people who are normally in your support circle, like people who might talk with you about what's going on at work or what's going on in relationship or what's going on in your family, they may or may not have the same value system and level of empathy and deep understanding of what it means when you lose a resident in this line of work. And feeling like you are grieving and managing that level of stress with other people who may or may not understand why it's so stressful. And the other interesting part of sanctuary work that can be very isolating is there's like a very perverse sort of reward system, in the sense that people, like when I say I run a sanctuary and I have a day job and I have teenagers, people will say like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Like, I don't know how you do it. It's incredible. And what I really want to say is like, dude, like I literally don't have a freaking spare minute. Like if I have 5 minutes to myself to like gather myself or grieve or think about things, like that's a pretty unusual thing. Like I am almost always doing something, and it can be very isolating to not be seen and understood. And oftentimes people will bring, like, to put a bow on this whole conversation, people sort of bring their own perceptions of what it means to run a sanctuary. From the outside looking in, they have sort of preconceived notions. They may admire the work that we do. They may feel like, gosh, that's really admirable. And but it's very rare to have someone who approaches you and seeks to understand and to like really understand, and to be able to set aside whatever their worldview is or their preconceived notions are about running a sanctuary and just be curious about what it means to run a sanctuary. And I truly think that if you're listening to this and you know someone who runs a sanctuary, call them up, like take them to coffee and ask them what it's really like. And if you are thinking of running a sanctuary, thinking about how you solve for the isolation, the different ways that you might feel isolated and how you can overcome that, will really help your overall mental health. It will help your satisfaction in the day-to-day of doing this work, and it will give you the outlets and resilience that you're going to need to just do this work day in and day out, because as we've talked before, the work of the sanctuary is just relentless. So I want to give a huge shout out to those that work on the sanctuary, either in paid positions or who volunteer. I cannot express enough gratitude for the people who financially support the work of the sanctuary. It is life-saving donations that permit us to do this work in the day-to-day and provide the residents with the care that they deserve. Stay tuned for next time. With so much love from the Muddy Pug.
I know where you are, and I'm coming to carry you home.